Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily update for September 15th, 2021. I want to begin by picking up on what I discussed yesterday from the standpoint of the topic, beware of false flags. As we have been discussing at the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche organization, we're on the edge of a new era with the withdrawal of U.S. troops and NATO troops from Afghanistan. The possibility that either we'll move toward an era of peaceful cooperation, which could be realized through collaboration for the development of Afghanistan, or this could be a step toward a bigger war. And I'm going to pick up on that because there were some very important warnings about that coming from very interesting places. And I'll also have a few comments on the failed recall in California. But the war danger remains issue number one. And let's start with this question of false flags, though. The BBC finally admitted, that is the British Broadcast Corporation, finally admitted that the story of Assad's government using chemical weapons against their own people was a fraud, one which was perpetrated by, among others, the BBC, picking up on stories from such phony groups such as Bellingcat, which is supposedly an open source investigative journalist body, but actually is a mouthpiece for MI6. The BBC has not gone to the full extent of identifying who was behind this, but they acknowledge that the chemical weapons, if they were used by the opposition, by the jihadist forces, and through their mouthpieces such as the White Helmets and the BBC, they blame this on the Assad government in the effort to cause the United States to launch attacks against Syria. And this was something which was discussed by the British ambassador, Kim Darroch, to the United States, who said they were trying to push Trump to launch a full-scale war against the Assad government as part of regime change. Useful that the BBC did this. Why? Why are they exposing themselves now? Well, let's wait and see and what else emerges. But on this question of the war danger, we have the comments from the Vice Chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, General John Hyten, who issued spoke 2 days ago at the Brookings Institution. And what he said is that our goal is never to go to war with China or Russia. He said, we never fought the Soviet Union. And today, for the great powers, our goal is to never go to war with China and Russia. Such an event, he said, would destroy the world and the global economy. It will be bad for everyone, and we have to ensure that we do not go down that path. Now, interestingly, there was no media coverage in the United States of this speech. This is significant. The Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs warning that there's not enough discussion, bilateral discussion between the U.S. and China. And he went on to say that while there has been more talk with Russia, and there's also the New START treaty, with China, we have nothing like that. And he said that in a previous statement, he said that he's calling for broader, low-level talks between the U.S. military and the People's Liberation Army. He said, I hope we can broaden that conversation all the way down to military level as well. He said the U.S. and China are not talking to each other a lot, even though they presumably have a common goal of avoiding all-out war. We have to have that conversation with the Chinese. We really do. We need to be able to sit down. I need to be able to sit down with Defense Secretary Austin, the political leadership, the State Department, and talk about these issues with China. Well, this is very significant because the U.S. and China are headed toward an escalated geopolitical confrontation over Taiwan in particular, but also in the South China Sea, with the demands for more weapons, more of a buildup, bringing in the European NATO forces into the Indo-Pacific region, all of which is headed toward confrontation. Now, why is this happening? Well, for the same reason there was 9/11, for the same reason there was the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the war in Libya, the regime change in Ukraine, because the globalists need these wars partially for the economic benefit these wars provide to the defense establishment, which is, by the way, not just military production, but consultants to the beltway firms, as well as the intent of the global corporations to use these kinds of issues to push instead for an end to sovereignty and a global system in which you have corporate cartels, including financial cartels, making policy. That's why you have these wars. That's why they won't give them up. And so we have this as a danger. And what General Hyten is saying is we need to have more talk. Well, these talks should take the discussion process that was identified by Helga Zepp-LaRouche as soon as the U.S., even before the U.S. Withdrew the troops from Afghanistan, where she said, let's work with China, Russia, India, Iran, the neighbors of Afghanistan, to take this failed state, which has been severely damaged by 40 years of war, and provide an opportunity for the children through bringing it into the Belt and Road Initiative, with the U.S. backing that. Instead, the Biden policy is not clear yet. On the one hand, they're talking about an end of an era, presumably meaning end of regime change. At the same time, they're talking about more vigorous confrontation with China and Russia over Ukraine. And so we're caught between these two paradigms. And what Hyten is saying is that if there's not adequate discussion between the U.S. and China, this could blow up into a full-scale war. Now, in that context, I'll just mention something that came out, which is getting a lot of media coverage, which is the new book by Bob Woodward and a Washington Post reporter, Robert Costa, which claims that General Milley, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Hyten is the vice chair, but Milley went behind President Trump's back to talk to the Chinese military leadership just before the U.S. election and right after the January 6th confrontation at the Capitol. Now, if so, he was violating one of the principles of U.S. Constitution, which is that the president makes policy, not the military. So we'll see more of this unfolding in the next couple of days, but this points to something which is quite dangerous and really has to be understood from that standpoint. Now, let me just say a couple of things about the recall in California. This was a smashing defeat for people who were trying to use recall to replace regular elections. You know, there's an election coming up in November 2022 for governor of California. Instead of spending $270-something million for a recall, why not build your forces for November 2022? Well, this was not about who's going to be governor of California. It was about heightening the polarization around these false points of false pivots, liberal versus conservative, left versus right, Democrat versus Republican. So California is a mess, but it's a mess which predates Gavin Newsom by 20 years. The California situation is a reflection of what happens when deindustrialization and globalization meet environmentalism and the worst forms of neoliberal economics. You know, California suffered the last recall in 2003 was based on the effects of deregulation of electricity, which was run by whom? The Republicans, run by Enron, the Bush and Cheney networks. They created a mess of California, and they did successfully recall Governor Gray Davis. Those policies continued. Now they're supported by both left and right. Deregulation, the speculative economy. Larry Elder spoke often of the fact that the median home cost, or the average home cost in California, is $800,000. Why is that? Speculation. We've moved to a speculative economy where prices are pushed up, not for the benefits of homeowners, but for the benefits of the financial interests that are being flooded with liquidity by the Federal Reserve. Virtually every problem in California is one of national bipartisanship on policies of neoliberal economics, environmentalism, and so on. So the focus on Newsom was what? It was an attempt to send a shock to show that people are still against the Democrats and with Donald Trump. It was an expensive shock, and the shock actually came to those who supported the recall, who thought this was going to be the biggest thing since sliced bread. Now, what it shows is that what's needed is real political discussion around fundamental questions of the economy, of the direction of the nation. And gimmicks such as recall, why does recall have some resonance? Well, because people don't want to do the hard work of transforming the political parties. They want some easy method of throwing out the bad guys without knowing what to replace it with. And the worst part of this, and the reason Lyndon LaRouche opposed the idea of recall elections, is that he said it's moving the United States away from the presidential system into a parliamentary system, where special interests, acting through political parties, can overwhelm the mandates given by voters. Newsom got nearly 64%, I think it was, in 2018 in the election. That was the voters of California who spoke. Now it looks like he's got another 60% against recall. The issue of being able to replace someone with a recall is how do you use momentary passions to overturn an election system and a process? So the parliamentary system, where does that come from? It's British. Who's calling for eliminating the U.S. presidential system? It comes from the British. It has since the 1930s, when Henry Kissinger's mentor, William Yandell Elliott, said that the U.S. presidential system was the greatest threat to the world. So people who jump in on these things feet first just had their heads handed to them. Now, hopefully we can straighten this out and we can get back to a legitimate discussion of what are the true interests of the United States, what are the true interests of California, and how do we address the problems which are manifest there, which are profound, but are not the fault of Gavin Newsom alone. They're the fault of the whole political class in both parties going back at least 30 years. So that's my report for today. I'll be back again tomorrow.